War and Peace in a World at the End of the Age. Max Davies Artielsci. Summer 2020. Since World War II, we have not won any appear decisive war absolutely and without both our foes and those would-be future foes, knowing it. They have used this as a means of accusing us of being bullies and cowards instead of the expressed goal of trying to keep the relative peace and maintain some level of global order. We have allowed ourselves to fall into the trap of empires and complicit nations opting instead to many small wars against easily defeated minor powers. We would have been better off to fight none of these and instead fight one big one, defeating them all at once, or fighting a major power decisively. Because we choose the former rather than the latter out of political reasoning or some other rationale, we have only fueled more wars and enemies against us, handed our foes their greatest narratives against us, making it appear that we are merely unbridled bullies, and diminished our ability to diplomatically and militarily gain the ideological and moral high ground which might have allowed us to avoid war in the first place. Our incessant proxy conflicts throughout the Cold War created the conditions for our present woes. Whereas it is understandable that we thought it to be the lesser of the evils when considering the implications of full-scale war between nuclear superpowers. I'll not go down that rabbit hole here and spark needless debate. What I want to concentrate on is why we haven't fought and won a decisive war even against those relatively small powers when we did fight. It is true that we emerged out of WW2 a reluctant superpower with arguably semi-global empire. However, it was the result, not the intent, of entering into the World War II. Afterwards we found ourselves in a global competition with the emergent hegemonic-inclined communists in the form of Stalin's Soviet Union and later Mao's CCP-led China. We then wound up having to fight more wars in Korea and Vietnam, along with numerous small covert wars around the globe. Essentially, we never were able to stop and breath after WW2. After 2 world wars, small hot wars, proxy wars and the overall Cold War, we found ourselves in an ever-present state of undeclared war abroad and at home. Our enemies were not content to leave American citizens in their bubble. Our foes sought to infiltrate and poison our society from within with many well-crafted intrigues and machinations in order to capture our culture from within our culture by gaining control over the 7 spheres of societal influence. Decades of war with their terrible effects on the fragile human condition left millions of American men physically and psychologically wounded. Though our economic prosperity helped as a tourniquet to stem the sum of the resulting societal effects, it was not sufficient enough to stave off the effects on the general nations. Even so, we still had some measure of confidence, discipline and moral and ethical restraints which helped us to overcome what might have destroyed us then. When combined with public fear of nuclear annihilation, social upheaval, an existential moral dilemma in fighting the Cold War, the cultural influences of foreign religions and traditions, the human propensity towards corruptibility made more vulnerable after many decades of the corruptions born in the human psyche due to war, America was unable to see how the convergence of these and many more factors would be further amplified by hostile actors using it all against us. It was their intent to rot us from within, using the already vulnerabilities present in our societal and its people. They simply used what was there against us to further erode our society through facilitating and promoting corruption and corruptibility in our nation. Slowly at first, then quickly, by the time of my birth in 1969, America began its moral and ethical decline as it began to become divided against itself. By the time I solidified my first memory, which was a news report by Walter Cronkite from Vietnam on TV, the nation had effectively broken in two. I was born into an America already at war against itself. I was born into what I would later refer to as the binary simulacrum, a two-headed double-minded society. A society being split along political, religious, ethnic, ideological, intellectual and economic lines. America, though shaken, still had some measure of confidence left intact. But looking back now, I can now see that the nation was actually losing both its religion and its confidence in its cultural identity and purpose. America had then been continuing to descend into societal entropy as the often idealized left-wing boomer communal hippiedom make peace not war idealistic mantra turned dark and mutated into the age of hedonistic selfishness, unbridled greed, drugs, violence, rampant immorality, leftist militarism, divisive ethnocentrism and a virulent strain of nihilism. The other side of the equation birthed the Christian right and a conservative political action-oriented movement bent upon standing against what they saw as the intentional moral poisoning and destruction of American values and faith. This began phase 2 of the culture wars. It was this I was growing up in. A confusing, often bipolar and contradictory divided America. Many sought to find a means of coexisting while others sought to keep any middle ground from being allowed to flourish in the insanity which would eventually birth our present troubled times. It was also during this time in my toddler years that America opened the door to Maoist China and the rise of an extreme form of radicalized hegemonic militant Islam. In an attempt to manage ever-increasing dangers in an ever-increasing complex domestic and foreign policy landscape, the government sought to find a middle path through the raging storms of societal divisions and geopolitical realities. They saw that our adversaries had been very effective in supporting those things in our society which were destroying us from within. They knew the narratives that were being spun by skillful propagandists and the poisonous seeds of destruction being planted here and around the world. They sought the high ground for the good of the nation and political capital abroad to fight against the great atheist and communist tide. Faced with bad and even worse options, they tried to choose between the lesser of two evils. They had attempted to this since the end of WW2 in regards to war. They sought to win hearts and minds, though fighting a war on one hand and positive influence operations on the other hand, hoping to instill American values and appreciation for freedom and liberty. They chose to wage war and wage peace at the same time. It failed then and has failed now. Why did we do it? We as a nation were not prepared for nor sought a global empire, but inherited one after WW2. We were not designed to be such. It was not in our national desire nor interests to do so. Yet that was where we found ourselves after 1945. Our Judeo-Christian foundations and collective worldview was perplexed by this worldly global responsibility. It simply did not fit what we thought biblical history would lead us to. Yet there we were. Even more profound was we were engaged in a global war against a murderous atheistic communist juggernaut around the world after enduring 2 world wars and the Great Depression. Policymakers were challenged to find some way of making our worldview fit the reality in which we found ourselves as a nation, as confused and perplexed as we had become. Still we faced what seemed like endless war and the prospects of global annihilation by our own nuclear weapons breakthroughs which were being matched by the Soviets. It was out of this haze and fog of war the idea of waging both war and peace come into its own as a means of rectifying our faith and worldly situation. Our enemies exploited this from the beginning of the Cold War to this very day. Their narrative was that with the imperialists bent on enslaving the world and waging endless wars for profit and power to subdue to the entire world. In reality that was then and is now exactly what they were trying to do. Deceive the entire community of nations into a lie, painting themselves in false light while working at diminishing our light. They projected their own actions and intents upon us even as they poisoned us and broke our external ability to fight it, making us appear to be what they always were. They succeeded eventually in part and for a time. But that time is now at its end. Now we have to throw off the appearances and not worry about their accusations and popular beliefs about us. Contrary to that popular belief, most Americans actually still value the importance of considering the implications of total war. We as an imperfect nation still try to do the right thing in nearly impossible and highly complex conditions. Sometimes there doesn't seem to be a clear right thing to do. Far too often we have hesitated in waging full-on unrestricted warfare such as what we did during World War II, not wishing to cause unneeded civilian harm. Even so, when the inevitable horrors and fog of war did so cause the deaths and suffering of non-combatants, we felt a sense that wrong had been done regardless of the intent. We as a nation had always held ourselves to a higher standard. Most of America does still. We were naive to believe our enemies and even many of our friends would respect that, knowing their own histories and the deep complexities and horrors of war themselves. What we did not anticipate was that most would not see it, choosing instead to see only our mistakes. Worse yet, even many of our friends joined the chorus of those hostile to our way of life and the foundations upon which our society was built by accusing us even as they denied their own insufficiencies throughout history. We allowed the darkness to turn our better angels inward and allowed the phantoms of our past and present rise up and tear us, beat us with self-accusation and doubt. We allowed our spiritual, political and economic foes use what was best about America against Americans out of denial, complacency and complicity with evil. An evil which seeks to take to residency in every human heart and mind. This was our Achilles heel. We lost our way in our perceived successful and our faith in God Almighty, ourselves and what our nation aspired to be. A godly nation who, though imperfect, believed in the grace of God and guided by the divine light of the Logos, the Spirit of truth and love, and the principles of freedom and liberty which they birthed in our hearts and minds, being fixed upon the highest calling, to seek to do God's will in all things. We became a people who forgot what made us great and instilled some measure of humility and honesty in each generation, granted to preserve both citizen and state alike while protecting what was sacred to us. War in the postmodern world. Now I am going to lay out the new harsh reality. Some civilian and military leaders, arguably since WW2, have failed to lead this nation on the righteous path, choosing instead to ignore wisdom in order to fight wars and be humanitarians. Many more embarked upon this path trying to find a way to rectify having to fight war and desiring to be peacemakers. They were both set up without regard to their intent. You cannot protect your own consciences apart from God and His grace in such a diabolical entrapment by your enemies. Were you not warned there would be wars and rumors of wars right up until the end? Let us clear up the confusion. Make up your minds. War is not a humanitarian affair. It is anathema to humanitarianism. If you go to war, you will have plenty of time to play the humanitarian and seek to heal the wounds war will cause once you have decisively and completely defeated your foes. You cannot do both at the same time and not cause both to fail miserably. Otherwise you should not go to war. Now we live in a time where wars will never end because, like in ancient times when Joshua didn't complete his task, it led to thousands of years of conflicts which continue even to this present day. So the very horrors of war have been multiplied precisely because you wouldn't fight a completely decisive war. Has this decreased human suffering? No, it has even increased it. Has it led to peace? No, it has decreased it and given weight to more false peace agreements. Blessed are the peacemakers. You cannot make peace with those who, being left undefeated completely, will only use to wage more war against you. War is not to be entered into for anything other than to protect your people and national interests. If you have to wage war, you better make damn sure it is one which is just and necessary for the temporal greater good, not for special interests, foreign powers, nor as a means of profiteering. For doing so will only corrupt the people, your interests and your nation. But if you must fight a war, do it without reservations about that which you are going to do. Have to completely and absolutely defeat your enemies, leaving no doubt that you have broken them beyond rising up and reconstituting their forces to give it another shot at you. War is and never has been politically correct. Those who desire it to be are not warriors nor understand the effects on the human personage, widespread destruction, tactical terrors and scarring horrors of warfare which result. They are unfit for the military and leadership and or acting in a civil capacity commanding it. War is not for the faint or heart, not ideologically double-minded. Not is it for the unprincipled and criminally minded. But it is brutal. It is hellish. It will leave all who have to fight it wounded existentially, if nothing else. You must account for this. You must prepare for it. You must be sober-minded about it. When given the task, use all means necessary to quickly, decisively and absolutely defeat your foes. Then you can show mercy in how you help them. You must break them before you try to offer them the opportunity to heal and become something better than what led them to force your hand to wage war against them in the first place. In this you cannot waver. You must be steadfast, and it will be difficult upon your mind, body and souls. Of this you can be certain. Thus you must be certain of the rightness of your cause before God and your own consciences, knowing the great and weighty responsibility that shall be upon you. You must remain humble throughout it all, yet courageous and take risk. You will have to take responsibility and learn from your mistakes, adapt, adjust and keep up the fight relentlessly until your terrible task is completed fully. You must be gracious yet firm to prisoners and absolutely brutally committed to those who remain in the battlefield against you. You must improvise and innovate, using what you have as you have it to bring to bear upon every situation you may find yourself in before, during and after battles. You must be determined regardless of the cost to defeat your enemies. Do you understand what I am saying to you? These are not times for the faint of heart, nor conflicted in purpose and duty. For it is both of those which dragged us to this point in history to even have to discuss these things. In conclusion, on war and peace, a paradox. Here wherein is the paradox? How do we maintain a strong defensive posture to act as a check against those who would take advantage of the lack of it, preventing war, and also not continue down the path of the militarization of our entire nation, which threatens the very liberties which it purports to defend and protect? This was exactly the existential crisis Eisenhower was defining in his famous farewell address. Is there a just war? Yes. Is war good? No. It's never a good option. Is it sometimes necessary? Yes. However, when war becomes an industry where it sustains itself by perpetuating more of itself, we have to call this evil and unjust. This was precisely what President Eisenhower was worried about, having seen the horrors of WW2 firsthand, both abroad and at home. This we have to always stand on guard against, while maintaining a balance of capabilities in a very turbulent world. No nation has been able to sustain a culture of constant war without devastating effects upon the entirety of the citizenry. The nature of war itself forces human beings to do what is contrary to their own humanity, regardless of their faith and ideological perspectives. The cascade effect of prolonged war upon the society is definitively destructive to the fabric of that society. A warlike society, either by necessity or by choice, ultimately destroys itself by means of those cascade effects of wisdom and discernment, eventually vacating the decision-making process. This can be seen throughout history clearly. This is also clear to see in our present age. War makes animals of men and widows of women. It leaves a vacuum in families and nations. For this reason it is important for leaders to never enter into the use of force lightly or blind to the subsequent consequences thereof. I am neither a war hawk nor a pacifist. I am a realist. And reality in history bears witness to the carnage of war upon not only the soldiers engaged in it, but upon those who are caught up in the middle of it, who through no fault of their own or choice suffer. The world is filled with violence and war. This so because there are some who are deceived into it, some forced into it, and others that lust for it. This has always been the case. A false peace always gives way to unjust wars. Likewise, unjust wars always give way to even more suffering and destruction without regard for race, creed, color or religion. War is terrible and necessary reality in a world filled with a humanity whose mortal nature is vulnerable to corruption and deception. An eye for an eye approach to national security is bad policy. It is better to not allow others to provoke you while never letting them know what the hell you might do. When combined with overwhelming military and economic deterrence, one has an advantage. How so? If deterrents fail, they provide ample justification for taking punitive action, while creating confusion in your unpredictability and your foe as to what will be brought to bear upon them when action is taken. This will keep them unsteadied and second-guessing as to what you will do and what they should do. For when you do have to action, they have provided you with enough cause and irrefutable evidence for the punitive response in the lead-up. When action is taken, it should be well thought out with definitive objectives and goals. The response should be swift, non-traditional, decisive and hidden from their thoughts, even as your unpredictability along the way provides you a strong position to continue utilizing your deterrence while you prepare to take that action. Be slow to anger and even slower to act. Be firm in warning as they continue to provoke and escalate. Then be unpredictable. Lastly, be decisive, crushing and lightning fast when you must take action. In Outdone. A fool loves war. An idiot starts one without thinking through the consequences. A wise man avoids war, yet when forced to enter into one, knows the cost of being both a fool and an idiot. The best way to win a war is not to have to fight one at all. The best way to lose one is to fight one war when your adversary is fighting quite another. The best way to win a war you have to fight directly, is to not fight it by the rules of those who don't have to fight it. War is not something to desire. It is something to always be prepared for if called on to fight the one which was being waged against you long before you get the call from those who suddenly figure that fact out. All visible wars are only the outworking of the invisible war that few see, and even fewer are prepared to fight because they deny that war exists. That invisible war is the one in each heart and mind long before their body shows the effects thereof. It is a spiritual and cognitive war. The kinetic always follows with devastating effects. As for people, so too it is for the nations. Admiral Max Davies